Okay, well, let's get started so that we can make the best use of this evening's time. Um, I do want to take time to welcome everybody on board and just a few house matters. That you all are being muted. All your questions should be posted in the questions, and we'll be answering those questions after each speaker has had a chance to present. For those questions that we're unable to get to this evening by the close of this webinar session, we're asked that you email those to us, and we'll forward them on to the presenters and get them to reply, and then we'll forward it back to you. Okay? Okay. All righty. Okay, so again, my name is Ron Hantz. I'm the founder and board president of Network for Developing Conscious Communities. And my colleague this evening co-hosting this webinar with me is Dr. Judy Lubin, founder and president of the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, known as CURE. Okay, so let me just frame this evening's discussion. And it's a much needed discussion that has gone on in the Black community for a number of years in terms of policies and practices around community development. And I do want to just note that, you know, a functional Black community should have a structure of social and political governance that regulates community development institutions and represents the collective interests of the community. In this discussion, our purpose has been to identify actionable strategies for dismantling structural racism through policies and practices that center on wealth building, economic development, and racial equitable development in Black communities. So I do want to take this moment again just to introduce you to our panelists this evening. I want to be in proper etiquette and allow ladies first. So I'll introduce Ms. Marla Newman, who is a Community Development Director of the City of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. She is responsible for the city's code enforcement, rehab, and first-time homebuyers blending program, as well as the community planning, real estate development, and public service grants programs. She operates the home and CDBG program, as well as the Housing Assistance Finance Funds and General Obligation Funds of the City of Winston-Salem. Marla is also the owner of a Blueprints Consulting, an urban planning and community development firm, and a faculty member of NeighborWorks America. She is a former executive director of the Louisiana Housing Alliance, director of economic development for 2 Kansas City, Missouri-based nonprofits, and program officer with the Greater Kansas City Local Initiative Support Corporation, formerly and known as LIST. Marla holds a doctorate of jurisprudence from the University of Texas School of Law and a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of New Orleans. Welcome, Marla.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Our second panelist is Dr. Henry Taylor, who is a full-time professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, founding director of the Center for Urban Studies, and associate director of the University of Buffalo Community Health Equity Research Institute. He is an urban historian and urban planner that focuses on city building, underdeveloped neighborhoods, health, and the built environment, as well as Black social movements. Dr. Taylor is a recipient of numerous awards and has written 5 books, along with many articles and technical reports. He has been cited in numerous national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the Atlantic, the Huffington Post, and Time Magazine. Dr. Taylor is a recipient of numerous awards, including the 2018 Marilyn J. Gittal Activist Scholar Award, which was awarded by the Urban Affairs Association. He is completing a book, From Harlem to Havana, the Nihahana Isotope, hit my tongue straight. The Nia Hanna, I saw part of my etiquette here, but I've been do a story. So I'll let Dr. Taylor pronounce that incorrection. Correct my etiquette with killing that name of the press. And our last panelist is Eric Jackson. Eric is the founder and serving director of the Black Yield Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. He's an emerging Pan-African institution based in Baltimore, as I said earlier.
Looks like we lost Ron. Okay.
From 2011 to 2013, Eric served as community health organizer with the Baltimore City Health Department. And the program that he managed was the Balti Market Program, where he established an initiative called Neighborhood Food Advocates. He worked to organize residents to improve access to healthy food in Baltimore City. Since 2013, Eric has been educating future change agents as an adjunct professor teaching community organizing and macro social work practice. From 2013 to 2016, Eric was employed by the University of Maryland School of Social Work in its Social Work Community Outreach Services Program, where he served as community school coordinator at the Harlem Park Elementary Middle School. Eric has received Bachelor and Master's of Social Work degrees from Morgan State University and the University of Maryland School of Social Work. Ultimately, Eric's vision is to organize and develop leadership within Black and poor communities with the goal of dismantling racism, building greater social, political, and economic power, and establishing self-determination through institution and nation building. Welcome again, all three of you panelists. I'm going to turn this first question over to Dr. Judy Lumpkin from CURE to address the first question to our panelists this evening.
Thanks, Ron. So, of course, I have a couple of questions prepared, and I'm not going to ask the question that I prepared. I just feel like, it makes sense for us to start by just kind of naming the moment. And I'd love to hear from each of you, what does this moment feel like? What are the possibilities in this moment, in this Black Lives Matter moment, in this moment where we're considering and talking about reimagining Black neighborhoods and challenging white dominant community development practices. So I'd love to hear from you, either from a personal perspective and the work that you do. What sort of comes up for you when you think about where we are right now, particularly in the context of the work that you've been doing, and where you see we could potentially be going as we talk about reimagining Black neighborhoods? Let's start with you, Dr. Taylor.
I think in a lot of ways, this is the best of times and the worst of times. I think that the pandemic and the flawed rebellions have awakened large segments of the white community and even some segments of the African-American communities that thought that we were in some kind of post-racial age. I think they've revealed the deep fault lines of structural racism inside of the country, and they've generated a reimagining of many of our institutions. The reality is that we're dealing with failed institutions. So when you look at the neighborhoods and communities in which our people live, large numbers of African Americans and brown people, we're talking about a failed real estate system. We're talking about a failed government. And we're talking about a way that the very way that we build cities create hardship and misery for our people. So I think this moment has created reflections where now we are no longer simply trying to build things within existing structures. We're saying, let's reimagine institutions, ways of doing things that are very different, but possible. And so a classic category is defunding the police. Defunding the police is not about getting rid of public service, but it says we've got decades of failed policing. That system doesn't work. So now let us reimagine something else, something very different, a whole new way of delivering services to people. So that's what I think about. So when I think about reimagining Black neighborhoods, it's about saying the system of building our neighborhoods has failed. I can go to any city in the United States and I can show you that failure. If this system has failed, then let's imagine how to create something very different and to generate very different outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Marla, do you want to share that that same question?
Sure. As I look at this time, there are elements of it that take me back to the civil rights movement. I think about the parallel struggle of the need to be recognized first and foremost as human beings, and the accord and respect and the dignity that demands. You know, but I also think about, and I really started reflecting on this when listening to Dr. Taylor, and this notion of you know, imagining our neighborhoods. You know, I don't know that there was a lot of intentionality in creating our neighborhoods or Black neighborhoods. They were by happenstance in some respects, but the notion that our neighborhoods were actually thought of or conceived to be something to serve and support us, I've not felt that for a very, very, very long time, if at all, quite honestly. I do think, though, that we're at a very interesting point in time. Yes, there's been an awakening. And so certainly I'm one who questions a lot. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is, okay, so what are we going to do? You know, what does this opportunity afford us? How are we going to, I mean, first of all, when we talk about reimagining, I mean, certainly that calls for some vision, right? And so what is that vision for our neighborhoods, truly? And then, you know, when we talk about how we move beyond, well, then what are the resources that we need to move beyond, right? I think about a good friend of mine, we talk a lot about, you know, some of the principles on which this country were founded, and how everything seems to kind of come back to the principles of land, labor, and capital. You know, and I think the phrase I've heard is, you know, America's a work camp, right? And so, you know, when we think about that, and then we think about the structure of our neighborhoods and sometimes the lack thereof, you know, we have to recognize, okay, what's that macro system that we're operating in? And then how do we position ourselves to, first of all, identify what those resources are that we need in order to do the reimagining and making this happen? But then how do we develop the capacity to actually do the work that needs to be done? Because we can identify the resources, but then do we have the capacity, or what does it take to get the capacity to actually do the work that we know serves and supports our highest and best needs? So that's kind of where I'll park that for now.
Mm-hmm. Eric, I know that you're a Pan-Africanist, and I'm quite sure you have some thoughts around this moment that we find ourselves in relative to this to movement. So let's hear your thoughts on the question. Just
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate one. I just appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. I'm on fire around this. I don't know if y'all saw me looking down. I was writing some notes. I'm not. I promise I won't talk about all of them right now. I'm sure we'll have opportunity. But I'll say I'm excited about this moment. This moment that I've been calling an again moment. And the reason I call it an again moment is because as Sister Marla talked about, it's reminiscent of other times that we may have read about or in some cases have lived through. And if we're not careful and we don't seize this opportunity, then it's going to happen again. So I call it an again moment for those particular reasons. And I think that what this again moment allows for us, and when I speak to that, I'm talking about this resurgence of popular movement, if you will, around movement for Black Lives and COVID-19 has presented an opportunity for us to engage in reflection. And I've long said on panels like these, but also in team meetings with folks and saying, look, we are fools if we don't spend some time reflecting. And I think that one of the things as it relates to the topic that this moment presents for us is an opportunity to, as Dr. Taylor talked about earlier, um, to kind of where people are active, right? So whether you're talking about white folks or other, our people or other folks are active in this moment, getting folks connected um, to institution building. And what I mean by that is building on the assets that exist and then getting clear about where the gaps are and filling those gaps. And when I think about power resources, I am talking about land, I am talking about means of production, and as well as building the networks and having these mediums of communication. I can go down the list, but I think that in this particular moment, it presents, at least for me, an opportunity to have the conversation about infrastructure in Black neighborhoods, in Black communities, and in Black locales. Because I think that in any moment, if we are students of movements, one of the things that we learn is that a critical part of movement building has to be infrastructure development. And I think that the way that you do that, and there are many ways to do it. The area that I operate in is a land and food, so I'm always thinking about agriculture and aquaculture. But thinking about, well, a moment like this, if funders and investors are thinking about this moment and what folks can do to shore up racial equity in some sense, then I think that we should provide the opportunity to say, look, well, invest in these infrastructure projects that allow us when we get to another again moment that we have the types of resources that we need if we play this out right. So I'll talk more about it later, but I think that what we need to do is hyper localize economic development so that for me, when I think about food, producing more food in neighborhoods, thinking pragmatically about, well, how much does an average person eat, and then what can we actually do? So if it's like, all right, well, we only have enough land on these vacant lots to feed, 10% of or provide 10% of the food for 100% of the people in this neighborhood, then we need to figure out how to do that, and then where the other 90 is going to come from. But that requires a whole bunch of organizing, going to old school tactics like house meetings, Zoom calls, phone calls, to figure out how we can just reconnect to one another and do exactly what Sister Marla talked about. That is vision and reimagine what we can be and what we can do together.
all right. Thank you. Marla, I want to come back and ask you a question because you raised this question about resources and capacity, and said with all the resources that even could be afforded to our communities, there's a lack of capacity for us to engage and do the work. So you've worked across sector in private sector, government sector. So in your opinion, why hasn't government and the private sector, but particularly the liberal philanthropic community, supported more capacity building in Black communities? What are your thoughts around that?
So first, let me make a disclaimer that the comments I'm going to share are my own and not those representative of the city of Winston-Salem. So I wanted to get that out of the way first.
Okay.
You know, I think part of it goes back to, maybe I'm a cynic, okay? There's money to be made in our communities, on the backs of our communities. And I think that the limitations around the funding to support capacity building is because there's competition. The more capacity there is for us to do this work in various shapes, forms, and fashions, the more somebody else is going to feel threatened about making their dollar. And you know, one of the things I think about, for instance, is you know, again, I'm stepping back to the civil rights movement and then some of the things that came out of that, like model cities, for instance. Now, in the community where I grew up, you know, that's when we had CDCs created, healthcare centers, childcare centers, all these things to develop our community. Nobody else was interested until somebody figured out, oh, wait a minute, there's money to be made in building X, Y, and Z in these communities, and largely compliments of the federal government and the low-income housing tax credits and all of this. And then you start to see a shift, right? And so then you have, you know, intermediaries, one of whom I worked with, but others, you know, come in like, okay, well, we're going to help build an infrastructure. We're going to help the capacity. But then they were choosing the winners and the losers, right? And so I think that there had been an illusion that there was help for us in the community. But in actuality, I think we were misled in many respects to see these structures as helping us. But in actuality, I think in many ways, they lulled us into complacency. And I think even today, even as recent as you look at opportunity zones and some of this other stuff, it's difficult for us to play in those spaces, you know? And so, but they're there because other people can make money off of them. So we continue to have the creation of these different programs, institutions, and structures that are really designed for certain folks to make a lot of money. Now, I'm not saying that we cannot participate and we don't have access, but I don't think that the broad level of participation and access that we should have, that we are actually enjoying right now. And I think that's by design.
Mm.
Now, like I said, now maybe I'm a cynic.
Say some things in relationship to that, Ron.
Go ahead, Dr. Taylor.
When we talk about capacity, we have to talk about capacity to do what? If we're going to reimagine our neighborhoods and communities, we have to start with the fact that the way we are building these communities has failed. That it has failed. And it has failed because of the model that we're using. So when I think about capacity building and a lot of the folks who want to come and help, we got to know what we're building. So for example, running a community land trust requires a particular set of skills that a lot of folks in the private sector, they just don't have. It's different. I learned the hard way that running a privately owned company is very different from running a cooperative. It's very different. And I think that the type of skill sets we need to build inside of the community are different from the skill sets that are out there that a lot of people we've built partnerships with have. So I think we need to begin to develop cooperative forms of ownership in our community. We've got to grab land trusts. We've got to build condominiums. We've got to build social enterprises that run very differently than privately owned companies. We have to look at how we can begin to engage on a regular basis in neighborhood planning. Planning is absolutely essential. There's an old African proverb that says that a person without a target cannot miss, and neither can they hit anything. So planning gives us a target. It allows us to begin to figure out, how do we blend the interests of renters and owners? How do we begin to build collective ownership inside of our neighborhoods and a culture that reinforces this? How do we begin to break the market model? The market model does not work, not for us and for many other people. So how do you begin to disrupt that market by creating elements that allow you to control the market? And this is why I want to go back to the original question about neighborhoods being happenstance. I don't believe in that. Gilbert Osofsky said that the spaces that Black people live in have been remarkably the same since the ending of slavery. Always marginalized, always underdeveloped, always the least desirable residential lands. We take that as normal. It just happened. It's like weeds growing. I maintain that the way we build cities, create these spaces, because in the United States, the valorization of land is based on its exclusivity. White space is valuable because it's exclusive. It keeps us out. It devalues our spaces. And on those devalued spaces, there is exploitation. Matthew Desmond, the Princeton sociologist, found evidence that in many of these dilapidated and rundown housing units, by deferring maintenance, by keeping property values low and charging high rents, the owners of these profits generate huge profits. Keeanga Taylor demonstrated in an award-winning book how the banking industry made billions off of bad mortgages to Black folks. Even today, the high budgets of police departments are for what? To keep and maintain us under control. I'm saying that in the sense that there are forces that we have to fight against in order to rebuild, develop, and design our communities. And it starts, reimagining, to me, starts with saying, okay, for 200 years, this way of building Black neighborhoods didn't work. What might be different? Like the brothers and sisters down in Jackson, Mississippi, they're doing something different.
Yes.
They're moving at this in a different way. The brothers and sisters up in that community in Boston, they try to do things differently as well. Wherever we see people making progress, we see them doing something different, and everywhere they attempt to control the market and the way it operates in our neighborhoods. So capacity building is huge, but we have to be aware of the type of capacity we're trying to build.
Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you for interjecting the term cooperative in your dialogue, because that's one of the spaces that we've been working at developing in our community, more intentionality around cooperative. Eric, do you want to chime in on this question before I pass this next question on to Dr. Judy?
Yeah, so I'd like to just add two things. I think when I'm in agreement with most, if not all, of what was said around capacity building. I think one of the areas that I think that wasn't mentioned is particularly around ensuring that, I guess, one of the areas of capacity, and I see that with the diagram that we have here on the slide, but just talking about spiritual, cultural, political, economic. And when we think about cultural, the question becomes, what culture and what cultures are we talking about? And so I think that at least it gets to this, something borrowing from what Dr. Claude Anderson talked about in his book Powernomics. He talked about these black codes, right? That like, well, what are the social rules that we're utilizing to embed within our cultural sharing, or culture that we're sharing, in order to create or to move toward the answer to that question of what are we reimagining, right? Or building capacity for what? I think we have to start with these very clear understanding, not only practical goals that we can measure with the metrics, but also what are the underpinnings of our development, so that we understand that not that everybody has to agree, but what are we doing? I would contend that if we are pursuing Black power or Black liberation as a framework, then we can't practice things that are counter to liberation, right? For example, if we don't have a code that, like, just like the Jewish community or even other so-called ethnic communities, where folks are like, well, we buy from us first, right? So we find, whatever that is, we keep the dollar in our community. We need to establish those, create those in Black neighborhoods or Black locales, and then also utilize those ethos, those values and codes to actually practice and teach and socialize others. So I think that one part of capacity is having those socializing institutions, including our faith institutions, our schools, to inject, if you will, the types of nonverbal, cultural, and educational underpinnings that allow us to actually get to whatever the answer to that question of what is our reimagining. And so I think one thing that I borrow from Latin American literature is this idea of ethno-education that is, I believe, infused with political education, right? I think that as you know, it was mentioned about Cooperation Jackson, right? So thinking about the ways in which we actually engage in political education as a part of what we do, and thinking about ethno-education as a direct act of resistance from just public education that allows folks to understand not only our languages, but also understanding what we come from and getting examples, so that when we start talking about principles like Sankofa, we're actually able to really not only know what that means, but actually engage in that. So for example, if you're asking me this question, which y'all might get to, how do we reimagine Black neighborhoods? I think one place to start is by studying maroon societies or maroon settlements, maroon communities, and figure out, well, what are the lessons learned, and how do we utilize those lessons to create the types of communities that we want to see within the context that we have, right? Not attempting to recreate, but to reimagine what we have now while utilizing the ancient and historic tools and knowledge that we have. So I think that's critical as well as we talk about capacity, not forgetting. And when we talk about moving beyond the legacy of white dominance, one way to do that is by actually remembering that we don't come from, I ain't gonna curse for the people, that we don't come from, let's just say, BS. We actually have some examples of what it looked like to actually control our destinies in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities. And then question is, what can we learn from those, and what is applicable in the 21st century?
All right. No question, Dr. Judy.
Thanks for that, Eric. So what I'm hearing is, what's the vision, and that we need to clearly articulate what the vision is, but also with that vision, there's resistance, right? Because what I was hearing from Marla and from Dr. Taylor and Eric is that the legacy has been that community development has been done to us, to our communities, not in partnership, not in consultation, and certainly not in a model of ownership, right? Where we own and control the agenda, the process, what type of housing is placed in the neighborhoods in which we live. And so much to unpack, right? So I do want to talk a little bit more about, like, what is the vision? Dr. Taylor, I've heard you talk about the just city, right? And so I'd love for you all to just unpack a bit more, what is the vision in which we own the process of developing our neighborhoods? Eric, you're teaching on it, right? Like that there's a popular education process, right, and a political education process that's involved. But what is it in terms of assets that we want to lift up and that are already in our communities that we want to lift up? But what are the other assets that we want to build so that we have healthy, thriving, sustainable communities, and where we have the resources that we need to live and to thrive?
Yeah, I think for me, when I look at many neighborhoods around the country, one of the most striking things that stand out is that we build our communities on land that other people own, and that we're not able to sustain where we stay. And when those communities are redeveloped, we're usually put out. So to me, as I begin to imagine a very different kind of neighborhood and community, the first thing I'm imagining is that we control the space, that we control significant amounts of the land. And that in a lot of cities, at least in the Rust Belt, I don't know about other places, but you'll find in our communities, a lot of land is owned by the city. So the process of acquiring this land, I think is a different strategy, but staying with the vision, I think that we're going to want to own that land, that we're going to want to control the local economy. I think as Eric had pointed out earlier, in most of our communities, speaking from an economic point of view, there's an enormous escape level. And by escape, I'm talking about money that spins out of the neighborhood without circulating. We don't control any of that. And we should control a good deal of that. I think the models that we want to use are the social entrepreneurship, and I think we want to use forms of cooperative ownership. A lot of the laws and a lot of the forces that are out there, they use these frameworks. And for example, it's possible for us to build businesses that generates community rather than individual wealth. That when we create the profits, those profits are reinvested inside of the community rather than going to individualized stakeholders. So we want a cooperative economy where the people control as much of that as possible. There are critical institutions that we want to have in those neighborhoods and communities in terms of food stores, et cetera, et cetera. Most important, the housing and the neighborhood conditions have to be at a high quality level and at the same time affordable. And one of the reasons that we go after community land trust is that allows us to create units that are of high quality, where we can use various forms of sweat equity and other forms of equity to reduce the cost of the rental so that those units can be affordable. We want communalized space. Communal cultures are formed when there are spaces where you can interact with one another. And I think we want to be able to build things there. And I'll kind of close, but I want to go back to this question of culture. To me, you have to infuse these communities with a culture based on certain basic principles. Participatory democracy is hugely important. Communal ownership and viewing this as communal ownership. I mean, a lot of places that have condominiums, they culturalize that as private as opposed to communal space. And I think that we want to stress that. I think we want to stress the values of reciprocity, of where we work and give to each other in those kinds of respect. And I think we want to build institutions like schools and others that are in service of the community. And I think building collectivism rather than individualism as a core value are things that I'm talking about on the cultural side of the equation.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Marla, I'd love to hear hear your thoughts on this. What does the vision look like?
So I would echo a lot of what Dr. Taylor has already shared. I think part of it for me, and maybe I'm looking at this also from a process standpoint, how do we get there? But because I share a lot of what has been said, and even thinking about the land trust, and you know, in ways though that you can partner at the very least with the city, as Dr. Taylor mentioned about a lot of the vacant land and so forth is owned by the city. I think there are some good examples in a number of places where there's systems in place where community can get access to the land, and certainly develop processes where, you know, even if the city had its own land bank, that it is populated by parcels that are purchased strategically, such that even if either community or the city can't build today, but it helps to buffer some communities from the threat of gentrification or what have you. And I know that's something that we're doing here. So there are opportunities, I think, to work in concert with the city to really be intentional about acquiring the land and putting the land to use for the community. So I kind of step back and go, okay, if these are the things that we need to do, how do we go about doing it, right? Because for me, it's like, how do I get to action? And so that's some of what I would be interested in us kind of kicking around a little bit as well, is what are some of those steps as part of the vision. But we certainly have to own more of the real estate, no question about it. I think that is huge. I tell folks every day I still want my 40 acres. But I mean, but you know, when you think about stability, right, as Dr. Taylor said, right, a lot of where we build our neighborhoods or our communities right now, we don't own it, and yes, we get displaced all the time. And so I think being very intentional about land acquisition is number one. And then looking at how you develop that land, how you maintain that land, be it the physical structure as well as the other types of ways you can use the land, as Brother Eric said about, you know, agriculture, aquaculture. I mean, we have a new hydroponics facility in the heart of one of our neighborhoods that's near completion. So looking at how do we combat these food deserts and other things. So I think it starts though, we got to have the land. And that's one of the biggest things that I would push. So I think a big part of the vision is get all the land we can get.
Y'all mind? Y'all saw me over here sweating trying to get into to it. I think so. I think also, you know, what I didn't say earlier, and I again really important that I think a part of the infrastructure has to be, you know, consistent reflection and action, or other words, praxis, right? And I agree with that. I want to talk about process as well. And so for me, again, the space that we occupy for the organization that I represent, Black Youth Institute, is around land and food. How do we control those things? But also, how do we control narratives? So I grew up in a community in Baltimore called Cherry Hill in South Baltimore, and it's a community that actually, while it was developed by the city, the social fabric, of course, was developed by the people. And so it's a community that literally, as long as it's been on the map in Baltimore City, it has been a Black community. Different than other communities that, you know, the phenomenon of white flight, and then we get to kind of get folks sloppy seconds. It has been a Black community. And so what I talk about when I say what I say, I mention it because I think that it's important to, again, return to those stories and figure out, well, what did our ancestors do to get here? And then also recognizing what legislation and other economic forces got us where we are today. And so it's still a rich Black community, but it is a community that has been struggling. And I know this probably gonna sound weird coming from somebody who was born in the 80s. Our community has been struggling since segregation became legal. And the reason I say that is because what urban developers and planners are speaking as best practices now, meaning mixed income communities. That's what we had. That's what it was built off of. And so ever since the crack epidemic that hit Baltimore in the 1980s, the late 1980s, Cherry Hill as a community has really struggled to figure out how to reconcile with that, with uh, the identity of the community pre 1970. So the reason I lift that up is because I think that that's important, and building off of that history, so that when we are thinking about process, that we're not continuing the same things that we do. And I think one of the things that we have to be able to do in considering hyper local economies, and I'm thinking again something as simple as being able to, as we already talked about, figure out housing, food, and clothing and other necessities, but thinking this radical idea that in Baltimore, they call Baltimore a city of neighborhoods. Folks from one neighborhood to the next, it's like, nah, I don't mess with y'all because we live here. Look, first we need to stop that. That's a part of the vision. If we're going to own land and we're going to control our destinies by building, again, infrastructure, whatever it might be, warehouses, and engage in hyper local economies. And a part of that, we talk about co-ops. We know that cooperative ventures help to create other industry, just like any other, types of, business structures create other enterprises, or the opportunity for other enterprises. So then if neighborhoods work across neighborhoods and say, you know what, our neighborhood actually produces socks and shoes. The other neighborhood, and I don't know if we're going to get folks out of wanting Jordans and Nikes. I like Under Armour shoes and Jordans and all that. I ain't even going to see it in front. But it's fine. What I'm saying is, whatever we can produce and it's economically feasible to do so, that we actually do that, right? So I think for me, if things happen the way that I wanted them to, we would build economies, and neighborhoods would be based on industry, right? We're not getting outside of capitalism no time soon, and I don't think that cooperative economics, and particularly cooperative development, is necessarily, it's an alternative to capitalism, but we have to operate within it. So then if that is the case, then why not create cooperative entities within neighborhoods that feed off of other ones? So if one neighborhood is producing certain crops and another community is processing them to go to, to different industries, or to different stores and retailers, I think that those are the types of innovative things that I'd like to see in Black neighborhoods, and going beyond white dominance. And when you talk about white dominance and the Eurocentric worldview, you're talking about individualism. If, as Dr. Taylor talked about, if we collectivize, then we think, you know what, we have enough land on this side, or actually where I work every day and where I grew up, we're on the water. If we can produce, if we can fish, and then y'all clean it in the other neighborhood, we all win, right? So just figuring out the best way that, again, doing market studies and feasibility studies to understand what's actually going to work, but then building these enterprises, and then also supporting and propping up cottage industries that already exist in our community. Like not pushing away from it, but if you got the candy lady, let's figure out how to keep her jamming. And if the candy lady up the hill is not working with the person down the hill, we figure out how to collectivize our resources, save, and profit more, or at least produce more. So I'm gonna be quiet because I can go on.
Let me just speak for a minute, Ron, on this question of economic development, because I think we make a big mistake, or I don't want to call it a big mistake, but there's another way to think about things. I hear brothers and sisters often say, well, we live in capitalism, therefore we stuck in capitalism like this. There's another way to think about that. I study economies. There's no such thing as a pure socialist economy or a capitalist economy. And so what we have to think is not we are in capitalism, but what we have to think is how do you begin to disrupt that existing model with something else? Look at the social democracies that cover most of the Scandinavian countries. The countries with the highest standards of living in the world have economies that are much more mixed than ours. On every indicator of human development, the United States ranks lower than most of the other advanced countries. So my starting point is not we're in capitalism, we must do as capitalism. My starting point is how can we disrupt this model? Look at the Biscay region of Spain, which built one of the most prosperous cooperative economies anywhere in the world. Look at the models of social enterprise, so which is taking a market framework, but adding new elements to that market framework that changes its voluntaristic characteristics. So the market is one thing. Neoliberal capitalism, which runs in the United States, is a very, very different kind of animal. So I'm saying rather than get trapped into the conversation of capitalism is capitalism, hey, let's take Reimagine different seriously. How can we begin to introduce other elements within the economy? One of the things I've learned from my studies of socialist economy and capitalist economies, all of these economies, whether they're on the socialist side or on the capitalist side, they take other forms of economic systems within them. You can build them within them. And we've demonstrated in the United States that some of the most prosperous enterprises out there are cooperatively owned. A lot of times I think you have an issue because there are certain cooperatives, like take New York City. New York City has probably more condominiums than any other place in the country. But they pretend that these condominiums are purely capitalist enterprises. But they're not. They're a bunch of people who came together to own a single building. They're run cooperatively. So we have to build cultures to reinforce the things that what we need to do. But I think we have to be creative, because if we're not creative, we'll end up trapped in the same model because we're not reimagining new ways of doing things. But we're trying to figure out how to fix something, you know, that's broke. But if we think differently, I mean, look at the churches. I'm always amazed at how these little poor Black people can continue to build all of these different churches. You know, I'm amazed at how they do that. So it's a question of how do we use the resources that we have. I want to make one point before I shut up. Power, because we haven't talked about that. And I think that we have to begin to look hard at power, that we have to begin to develop a new political strategy, a strategy that begins to see us electing people to office that are rooted in our philosophies and rooted in our beliefs. And again, I think it's worthwhile to look at what the brothers and sisters in Jackson are doing and the model that they're building, because they seize political control. I'm not about, I believe in controlling government. And in a lot of places, we have the capacity to gain control, but what do we do with that? How do we use that power? Do we use that power to do the same thing that the people who were there before us? Or do we use that power to build these reimagined neighborhoods? And I will take it one step farther. Reimagine cities and reimagine regions, you know. And anyway, that's what I'm talking about. Let's be bold at all the locations and places, and let's drive as far as we can this reimagining process.
Okay. I want to interject a process into this conversation. Last year in October, we hosted a symposium in Baltimore City, and Dr. Taylor, both you and Marla participated in, where we discussed racial equity and what that should be looking like as a framework to help elevate this work that we need to be having in cities and a practice and a framework we need to have inside of government. And so I know that we have some white-led organizations that are now participating in this call this evening. And one of the things that I have been challenging those organizations around is how they're framing their racial equity work racially in Black communities. And so when we talk about LIHTCs and the concentration of low-income housing in certain areas where there's no diversity, but you're inundating one community with certain type of housing mix, certain kind of income mix, and not looking at the landscape in terms of how you diffuse it throughout a city. One of the things I wonder, and always challenging every organization, what is your framework around racial equity? How are you sharing your resources and your capacity to help build other Black organizations that in communities where you're working? And so someone had mentioned learned lessons, and I want to just go and ask the question, what learned lessons did we learn from Greenville, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street? Because here was a city that was Black, a city where a part of it was Black owned and run, where we had land, we had businesses, we had an economy. And so violence was brought upon that sector of the city, and wealth was stolen. And so if we look now in terms of the frameworks we are now around community development, gentrification is a different kind of violence now in our communities, because it's economically displacing people, it's economically displacing culture, and it certainly is not building the pathway for a participatory process in decision making, because there's an economic motivated agenda attached to gentrification. So my question to all three of you panelists this evening is what are the learned lessons? Eric, you mentioned that we've come a journey, and there's lessons that we've learned along this journey. So if we would have to leave this conversation right today, what are the tidbits, the nuggets of learned lessons can we leave with the audience this evening as we work at concluding this discussion? What things can we leave with them in terms of their practice around community development and how it should look like in communities of color, particularly Black neighborhoods?
Let me say this, and this would be the lessons I think I've learned from my studies of Black communities historically, and even as a Black person growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, where they had a very prosperous Black business and middle class. Growing up in Nashville, until I left town, every place I went was to some Black place, a Black grocery store. If I got the money out of the bank, I went to the Black bank. If I got sick, I went to the Black hospital. If I needed some pharmacy, I went to the Black drugstore. What I've learned from all of those experiences is that all of those economies were based upon a private ownership, traditional capitalist model. It was based upon the creation of a wealthy class of Black people that were expected to be philanthropic toward everyone else. So if I've learned anything over the time, I think it's a mistake to try to build a Black Wall Street. I think what we need to create are systems of community wealth. I'm talking about a very different model. I've seen this model. We've got Black millionaires out of the wazoo. We got more Black millionaires than we've ever had before. And with all of those Black millionaires in the United States, it's not enough to keep our median household income from being just $40,000 a year, the lowest among all racial groups in the United States. all of these millionaires in this country, and our home ownership rate of 43 or 44%, it's literally no different than it was when the revolution around home ownership started. That model will not work for Black people. So that's why I keep going back to building community wealth through community ownerships, through communal structures and the like, because we will not ever be free with the other model. We've seen it tried since the ending of slavery. That has been the developmental model that we have used. And in every stage of development, the creation of individualized millionaires has not benefited the race, not to the extent, it's not gotten us free. So I think that we need to move in a very different direction. Now, I'm not opposed to people who develop those individualized forms of wealth. I'm not opposed to that at all. But our strategy has to be that collective wealth. The second thing that I've learned is that we have to elect politicians that share our values, share our beliefs, and that are going to use the arm of government in order to develop and grow the African American community. So the two things I've learned, and I'll stop for there. We have to promote community wealth and collective ownership, while at the same time, we have to elect politicians who are running on platforms that will promote our community.
All right. Marla, do you want to add to that?
Well, certainly, I'm very much in tune with Dr. Taylor on the notion of who we elect. I think that is so critical, and you know, really understanding who it is we're electing, because I think that sometimes those we've elected have not always carried the banner in the ways that we've needed most. So I think that's extremely important in what I've seen over the years. And I think as part of that, you know, really trying to cultivate more of a culture of servant leadership throughout our community, not just in our elected officials, but throughout our community. What you know, I think, well, let's take a step back. You know, when we talk about community, what does that really mean? And what does that look like? And how do we have a conversation and reach consensus? Because I think that's another thing, you know, what might mean community to me may mean something different to others, right? And I think that one of the things I've learned is we need to be clear on what it is, again, what the vision is and what it is we're trying to do. I think there was a point in time when we had a shared and collective vision. And I think that we've had difficulty coalescing around a shared vision. And so I think figuring out how we get back to that, and I do think that this time that we're in right now is an excellent time to really start to have those conversations again. But I think that, yes, getting to understanding what we mean by our community, our vision, you know, what our neighborhoods look like. You know, I think that, you know, we'll find that there are opportunities to take, you know, some of the better elements of some of the things that have worked against us. And I saw, like capitalism, for example, there's some elements from capitalism that we can take and we can use and we can leverage. How do we do that without all of the rest of the baggage that comes along with it? How do we incorporate the cooperative manner of building community and sharing resources and defining our own destiny? So I think that really the need to get clear again and reach consensus on vision, make sure that we elect servant leaders and that we all become servant leaders. I think those would be some of the lessons that I think I've learned over time.
Eric, you want to comment?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things. First, I would say, especially it seemed like you were saying, talk to those white institutions talking about racial equity, right? So one, I would say, slow down. Slow down. Folks just want to do stuff. One of the parts of, or one of the impacts, I believe, of nonprofit and industrial complex, which is just a tool of the larger, I think, notion of imperialism, I think, and white supremacy. I think folks just feel like they can do something. I want to come and do something for your community because you need help, right? So like, instead of making assumptions, ask questions and just slow down and respect the perspectives and experiences of the people who you're trying to help, right? As a social worker, the one thing I would even say, even as I would when teaching and telling folks, and even I teach my children this, it's not help if it's not helpful. So, I mean, one way to help people is by asking, do you need help?
Yeah.
And if you do, how can I help? So that brings me to my next point, and that is that I think one way that people can practice racial equity is by I always tell people this: start where you are and what you have, and thinking about what privileges that your whiteness has provided you, or what privileges afford that we've been afforded, and how we can utilize that with the answer to that question of how I can help you, if I can help you at all. And ultimately, as that old adage talks about, that notion of, if you're here to help me, then you can leave. But if you're here because your liberation is tied with mine, then you're welcome, right? I'd prefer that. But then two more things. Lastly, I think folks, we need to change our frameworks, that we recognize the value of one thing in particular. In doing so, recognizing the value of experiential experts. I work in too many processes, planning processes, infrastructure building, all these coalitions and all that at all these tables where there's people who just don't understand, that there is a difference between, and there's value in technical experts and in experiential experts, and we have to be able to respect and honor all folks, just like other organizing frameworks have done. And recognizing that, again, that the framing of problems are important, and how we talk about those in the space that I again, bringing the food piece up, recognizing that, man, how we frame the problem is how we're going to go at the solution. If we just see the problem as we need grocery stores, we're going to be propping up corporations and plopping grocery stores into a community, and rather than stepping back to see, what, do we actually need a grocery store, or do we even need to outsource that kind of help, or can we insource it, right? What resources are available? Could we build a co-op rather than asking Whole Foods to come in? So thinking about frameworks. And then the last point that I'll make is that we need to, in community development, we need to build power, not programs. Sister Marla talked about that earlier. There have been programs, federal, state, and other public programs, and even nonprofit organizations that actually do a good job of providing services. And for generations, folks are finding that they're providing the same services to the children and grandchildren of the people they started with. That's not the notion. And I mean, that goes for nonprofit entities, public entities, and private entities that don't, see that piece. And we know that we're the issues that we're talking about now, and how we experience white domination, in community development, from how we European-centered thought to practices, have everything to do with this idea. I believe that we need to control our own narratives, and we need to be able to build off of our own experiences to, and our visions to create those things. So again, power and not programs. And I think that's just it is just my thought. That's the way to do it. And just reconsidering, if we're going to reimagine, we have to actually reconsider the approaches that we're taking and the frameworks that we're utilizing. Otherwise, we are going to perpetuate the same mistakes, and we are going to stay in the same issues and sound good. And 20 years later, like, remember when we were trying to do that thing, and actually not making progress. So that's my take on that.
Okay.
I'd like to add just a couple of things, Ron.
Dr. Taylor, hold one sec. Hold what you got. I just want to just point this question to Judy. It's 8:15 right now. We scheduled to finish up at 8:30. If folks are willing to stay an extra 15 minutes up and take this up until 9:45, we can give folks who on with us a chance to ask questions of all of you. Are you willing to stay on the extra 15 minutes?
8:45, you mean, right?
Well, great. Go ahead, Dr. Taylor, and you.
Yeah.
I was going to say that one of the things that we're doing locally is that we're trying to introduce to our white colleagues the whole notion of anti-racism. That anti-racism means that you have to actively begin to dismantle the structures of racism, and it's about understanding those elements that have to be gotten rid of. Another part of the way we've started to work in Buffalo is that our community groups, our key community groups, are no longer raising the question of or going forward into institutions like the university and others and saying, this is what we need, this is what we want. Can you deliver this, or can you work with us to get this? In the old model, it was about folks coming into the community and saying, what can we do for you? As opposed to the new model that we're trying to build, where folks from our communities are going to government. COVID-19, for example, we didn't ask, we went to government and said, this is what we need you all to do. These are the resources that we need you all to implement. These are the plans that we need for you to do. When we went to the university, we said, this is what we need you to do. And that was to build a research institute to complement another one. And this is how we want it done. And then we're trying to blend residents from the community in every single thing that we do. We're in the process of finishing a grant for $1.4 million that will allow us to develop a strategy for combating the